Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives from the world's leading global brands. Today, we have a special guest on the show. We're joined by Kristen Anderson, who's a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Barilla Group. Welcome to the show, Kristen. How are you?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I love your background, by the way, for everyone listening. It looks like you're in a spa.
Well, I wish I was in a spa, which are all closed here in Italy. No, I'm in Italy, and this is the apartment with the wood, but it's all inside, no spas.
Yeah. You had that amazing background in the last event we had, right? Was that right? Because I think when you came in, everyone thought you had a green screen background.
Yeah, they did. They thought they thought that it was a fake background, but they said, no, that's actually the apartment in Italy. Mm-hmm.
It's pretty amazing. And for those of, I'm glad you mentioned you're in Italy because probably people wouldn't have gotten that given the accent.
yeah, exactly. The American in Italy, it's not a natural thing. People used to say, oh, where are you located in the US? No, I'm not. I'm in Italy.
How long have you been there?
Been 10 years in Italy, 10 years working for Barilla.
Wow. Do you speak fluent Italian? Say fluent.
No, parlo un po' italiano, non bene.
Yeah, so you're good enough. You're good enough.
Because it's our company has two official languages, and of course, if I'm, it's Italian and English, and so if I'm in meetings or if I'm talking D&I with going to our factories, because we have 28 factories, we have 10 in Italy. So of course, if you want to talk about how to be more inclusive, doing it in the local language is always the best.
Yeah, especially they can see that you've made that effort, right?
Even if you do it in a bad American accent, it's still.
Yeah. Must have been tough though when you first moved there then. Did you know any Italian when you moved there, or
No, I knew what you call maybe tourist Italian, so you'd be a polite way to order something.
Yeah,
but I moved to Italy from China. I was actually working in China for Coca-Cola.
China to Italy. Talk about a culture difference.
Yeah, and I tried to learn some Mandarin, so that was a challenge as well. So wherever I lived, because before China, I lived in Germany. I lived in Munich.
When was you last home?
Wow, it was I left the U.S. in 1999. I left and since then I've been working overseas in different places. First it was Australia, and then to Germany, and then to China, then to Singapore, then to Italy.
Incredible. And is that with the family as well? How was that?
Yeah, so it's with the family, with my husband and our family of pets. We've adopted homeless animals, so we have always a mix. Some from Germany, some from Australia. Cats and dogs, so they travel with us.
Wow. Was that always a plan then to have this international kind of, I say lifestyle, but I suppose it is one in the same now. So was that always a plan, or was it just a series of events that just led you to that role? And then you kind of, Kristen's great at these international assignments. Maybe she wants to move over here. How did that roll out?
Well, I think it's a little both. I think it's a high interest because, growing up, my background is chemical engineering. So I have a bachelor's and master's in chemical engineering. So my father is a scientist, and I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which some people might know is where the atomic bomb was developed. And there's a very big scientific laboratory there. So I got the science part, a lot from my background and from my father, and my mother is a language teacher. And so I studied languages too. So I really had an interest in that. And then when I was young, we lived in Wales for a year. And so I think that kind of sparked my interest in cultures.
Wales in
Swansea. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
We lived. And so I think, so when I started working, my career started after I had my chemical engineering master's degree. I started working in the food industry, running R&D, developing products and running R&D teams. And that's what I did for 10 years in Chicago. And then I asked if there would be an opportunity and my husband as well, to move overseas with Kraft. And they were great, and they gave us positions in Australia. That's how it started 7 years ago.
Nothing to do with HR, just for everyone listening.
Yeah, nothing to do with HR. Engineering.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm on the HR podcast, but I think diversity and inclusion is for everyone. I think that's my message. I mean, it could be anyone. There's no expert on who's the expert on diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, it just so happens to fall most of the time with HR, but it's
everyone's job.
Exactly, it's everyone's job. What I think is really interesting though, and I feel like it's kind of meant to be that you're in this role, is given the wealth of experience you have across multiple cultures, regions around the world. I'm sure you must have took so much away from working in those different environments and with different personality types, different cultures, that it makes sense almost that you kind of landed in this role. How did that happen? Or where did the opportunity come from? How did it land on your lap?
Yeah, so when we started the D&I work in Barilla to make the culture more inclusive, to have more diverse workforce. We basically, our chairman, Guido Barilla, and our CEO, Claudio Corzani, they basically formed the D&I board, and they created this chief diversity officer role, and it reports directly to the CEO. So it really shows a high level of leadership commitment. And the two sponsors are, our chairman, Guido Barilla, and our CEO of the D&I board. So, and the first board, they asked me to be on it, probably, as you said, Chris, because I had some international experience and some cultural understanding. So I was one of the committee members, because our board's made up of 10 internal committee members from around our Barilla world and external experts, and then our sponsors. And so that's how I started. I started working on the committee, but all of our people working on D&I have two roles, two hats, a business hat and then a D&I hat. So I was on the committee, but I was still working, leading the part of the research organization. And then after 3 years, the CEO said, because would you take over as chief diversity officer? Because that role is also a rotating role. So you're always bringing in new committee members and a different chief diversity officer after 3 to 4 years to get new ideas.
Is that the plan? To keep that diverse.
Yeah, because I personally think that all of us get used to the way we do it. We like the way we like the ideas that we have.
Our own biases and our own ways of doing things.
So we try to rotate these roles and have everyone has a business hat, so it gets embedded in the business. That's the concept as it was designed, and that's how I ended up in this role that I have now.
What was the biggest challenge then you faced in terms of building the D&I function and its efforts throughout the organization?
Yeah, I think, Barilla is a global company. 8,400 employees, but, really a family company that's based in Italy. So more than half of our employees are here in Italy. And also more than half of the total employees are in our manufacturing facilities. So the main challenge, I think, that we haven't solved it yet, we're still working on it, is how to embed D&I throughout all parts of the organization. So it's not viewed as, even just the D&I committee's role or my role or the HR's role, but it's something that everyone finds a value in being more inclusive. Every individual that's working at the company says, I could be more inclusive of, and we give them the tools on how to be more inclusive, and that becomes part of the culture. And that's going to be the benefit in the future for the company if it becomes, as we become more and more inclusive of different.
Where did you start then? What are some of the practical things that you did for others that perhaps listening that may be on a similar journey? There's a brand new role in the organization for you, the business. What are some of the initial steps that you took?
For people that are starting, and I think I say sometimes to people, to other companies or other chief diversity officers, starting now it's not bad. You have a great opportunity to learn from others. People that were starting 20 years ago were really paving the way. They had to do a lot of things without ability to share best practices because there weren't a lot of other people maybe working on D&I. Now there's lots of D&I communities where we can learn from each other. And I think that's the nice thing you and I were talking about before. It's not a competitive space.
No.
There's nothing, why not share what's worked for us? Maybe it won't work for someone else, but at least, that was for us very, very beneficial. The fact that on our D&I board, we had three and always have had 2 or 3 external experts, people that advise us at what other companies have done and what they've learned, so that we can say, is that going to work for us? So learn from others, whether it's, organizations like Catalyst, which has really been helpful for us, or in Italy, Parks, which is for LGBT inclusion in the workplace. These organizations have been really beneficial. You'll connect with other people working in the D&I space and other companies, or get external experts on your board. It can really be helpful. So that was something I think really has helped us in this journey. Then I would say a couple other steps. We did training, basic level of training for all of our employees back when we started.
Is that everyone, or did you just start at the leadership first and then roll it out?
We did leadership. We did focus groups to hear from others. We did also the training for our sales force and manufacturing, but we tailored it. It wasn't a long training for.
Was it external company you brought in, or did you do it internally?
We did an external with a Corn Ferry.
And then did they kind of certify particular leaders in your business to continue that work? Because I know some companies do that where they bring in a Corn Ferry, they become sort of certified, as it were, and then they continue to lead those sessions. Did you do something like that?
Well, now because of the virtual space, we've actually tried to incorporate those elements into our leadership training or our individual contributor training. So it's kind of self-generates. So when someone's starts new, they take a welcome to Barilla, which has D&I element. Then when they take leadership training, it's embedded. So, but we did it as a big initiative because people didn't really understand why D&I. What's the case for D&I?
What was that reaction when you kind of did this? Because I hear so many, a lot of people were saying recently that, unconscious bias training doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when we did the beginning training, we didn't really do unconscious bias training, but we did explain the concept of bias and the value of being more open-minded. But I think your question specifically about unconscious bias training, we've had a similar experience. If you, kind of force or strongly suggest people to take the training, it has kind of a bit of a negative connotation. You have to kind of encourage people to be willing to listen to help me more inclusive. That's how we're now approaching it, especially in this virtual space. We've been having recently webinars that are open to all of our employees on inclusive behaviors.
So rather than trying to bring people to you, let them, come to you,
kind of more draw them.
Yeah, because otherwise it does feel like, oh, why am I being brought into this training? Maybe I can imagine how some people may perceive. There's immediately this sort of wall that's going to go up, isn't there, for that? Whereas if you're kind of just opening it up for everyone and then say, come along, I can see how that'd be a bit more effective.
Especially if people can take away one or two tips, for being more inclusive. And we have had some specific webinars that are being about inclusive behaviors virtually. How can you nudge a little bit to be more inclusive when you have many people remote and some people not remote or virtual?
Yeah, that's in it. That in itself is that kind of an emerging challenge, isn't it? That we're seeing with the virtual element and how that plays. Because I even in my own organization, I've only got a small team here, but I realized that the personalities and on can sometimes overrun our Zoom calls. And it means it by nature is not even inclusive because I don't have an opportunity for everyone to be heard on a Zoom call. Whereas when we were in the physical workplace, they could, grab me and have a conversation to one side, or, we can have that, whereas on virtual, you can't really do that in a way. So I realized I had to change the way I approach communicating with our employees, because I realized that it was favoring some and actually others, their voice wasn't being heard. How are you tackling that?
No, but I think that's an excellent point, Chris. And that's one of the pieces that we are really, really thinking about. It has to be a conscious thought process to make some of what used to be informal ways of networking or coaching or mentoring, or having a coffee or having lunch. Now we have to formalize them, because in some ways, the new blended way of working, let's call it that, has a positive effect. When we were all virtual working, it's one, like here I am, one person behind a screen. There's no power center. There's no meeting, room where there's 10 people gathered and then there's two
no
people
big
calling
for the executives.
Right. Yeah. And people trying to get their voice heard, as you said, when they're virtual and everyone's kind of talking quickly in a meeting room. And sometimes with different languages and not with, English as the first language. So it has all those challenges.
So many things.
Now that we're all behind the screen, we can't all have our voice. But for certain people, it can be quite maybe frightening or stressful to speak as a one person behind the screen. And again, I always take the cultural elements. Maybe it's introvert or extrovert. Maybe it's English, not my first language. Hierarchy plays a role in all of this.
The circumstance, right, of their home, right? So my wife's at home with our daughter screaming
oh yeah,
her head off in the background. And, she's like, well, the house is a mess. My daughter's screaming. Now I've got to jump on this call. And sometimes you don't take this into consideration as well, that there's other things going on. Now work is home and home is work
right.
As well.
And in some ways it's good because maybe we feel a little less that we have to be perfect. I have my cat that came across the other day and sat on my laptop during a webinar and turned off my mic. And so, there's things that happen.
That was just fun, to be honest.
Yeah.
No, I love those moments, to be honest. I think that what makes us all human and connects us even closer together. But
it can also reinforce some stereotypes, because if I see your background, for example, and I don't know you and I just met you, but I now have some kind of bias. And we all know during times of stress, our biases increase. It's the way it is when we're stressed and there's more discrimination. So if I'm biased because I vote something about you, and then I see something in the background, your background, that reinforces that you mentioned, okay, the apartment's a mess or something. Unfortunately, that can reinforce some of my biases if I have them. So we have to also realize that, there's some almost like coming out that's with our backgrounds of what we're showing and exposing the rest of people to in our private life.
I can tell you an example, and I shared this recently on the summit that my wife, obviously she's at home with she's balancing 3 days a week, working when my daughter's at nursery, but 2 days a week Robin's at home, and those 2 days are really tough because she's looking after our 2-year-old and doing a full-time job.
Mm.
And there was an opportunity that came up, a role in her company that she was overlooked for, and the manager, unconsciously, I think they thought they had her best interest at hand, was like, oh, didn't think that you'd be interested because you're pretty busy right now with Robin. And, in fact, whereas my wife was like, well, it'd been an amazingly welcome distraction and something fun that I can delve into, that I'm excited about. But the assumption from her manager and the leadership team is, oh no, let's give Tasha a break right now. Which she was massively demotivated by that. And it took she spoke to them and told them exactly what I just told you. So it's no secret. She won't mind me saying it, but I'm sure that's happening. That's just one example. I'm sure that's happening all over the world in many different ways.
Yeah, because bias comes in many different forms, and that type of bias, which is really almost like, it's like it's the caring bias. I think
I was hoping you.
Yeah, exactly. And there's stories. One of our first advisors, Patricia Bellinger, who was really in our D&I board. She was so helpful for us. She's the second in charge of our Harvard University now. And she said that when she was chief diversity officer of British Petroleum, the similar type of conversations about succession planning would happen. There'd be an opening, say, in Indonesia for a country manager, and there's a woman and a man that are in succession planning. Well, let's offer it to the man because it's going to be very difficult in this context for a woman to be a leader. So people are talking about this in the way that they think is really, helpful, caring, warm. But as Patricia always said, you should offer it to the candidate. They can decide.
Choose. Yeah.
Let people.
The worst thing they're going to say is no. Can't come.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very, very, very important. Do you think that's one of the biggest challenges as well? Like, do you think I can imagine that being pretty common practice or common.
The bias of that?
Yeah.
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 But there's also, we know there's bias about how people are included in calls or in meetings, whether who's always called upon, who's the one that you're having coffee with, who's the one that you're informally networking with. And that's the concern. That the question you're asking me before is, do we think that there may be some exclusion in the future blended way of working? Yes. Let's imagine people that can come to the office who want to come to the office, every day. And maybe they're not, not all sorts of diversity, maybe because, of caregiving, certain people have to stay home and certain people come to the office. And if you're informally mentoring those people and then giving those people the projects, as the example you said of your wife, giving those people the key projects, and then let's just imagine in performance review time, those are the people that are more highly valued. You can see how the, in the office or outside of the office can potentially lead to some bias. And that's what we have to really watch out for. And that's what we're going to do in Barilla. HR is going to really watch the performance review process for 2020 to make sure that we can really understand, are people getting valued higher because they were around in the office, so they were able to come or wanted to.
Big concern for a lot of people. I've heard so many people talking about that issue of, if I am working from home and I'm not there, I'm not in that meeting, I'm not in that discussion, will I be overlooked? And it's completely understandable. And I think it's going to be a real challenge for organizations, because again, it's unconscious by nature. If you're seeing that person every day and having a conversation with them and you're not speaking to that person at home, apart from the scheduled meetings that you may have, naturally you may be more inclined to offer the opportunity to that person.
Exactly. I think that's why we really have to think about formalizing. And I know people don't like to always say, I don't want to formalize mentoring, but this having virtual coffee is going to be a part of the new blended way of working. We're going to have to really think about that consciously. Because as you said, the bias can come in unconsciously. And if we don't think about, have I connected with that person on my team, in the last week, when I've also connected with someone who made me office 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. How did you and the team, or have you, because it's ongoing, dealt with the whole, the challenges and issues around the Black Lives Matter movement, social injustice? How was that for you and the team? And it's obviously continued as well. What kind of work are you doing with the team to ensure that this is something that you're talking about? in the organization.
Yeah, no, and as you said, it's not a work that ends. It's a work that starts, and it needs to continue. So our Americas team, our Barilla Americas team, did a great work having a days of understanding conversation, bringing in experts to talk and listening to the employees. We had a day of understanding that had people from all our 2 factories in America, people from around the world, employees sharing their experiences. Our head of HR also joined. And so really it started there. There's been specific KPIs that have been developed by the Americas team on having more Black people of color in everywhere in the Americas offices and factories. So I think they really started the conversation, and also the setting KPIs, because again, you need to have a KPI. We don't achieve what we don't measure. Mm-hmm. And now the conversation has moved to Europe. We're having even just some sessions coming up in 2 weeks on racism in the context of Europe. Because
is that again self-selection for that, or are you just is that something you opt into?
Yeah. So what we did, a good question. We started with our global leadership team, which is the first line that works for the CEO, and we had a special session with them. And a person whose name is Dr. Derek Gay. He's from Chicago. He's a professor, and he also is really he's Puerto Rican. He speaks multiple languages, so he's quite a diverse person. And he did a session on racism outside the context of the U.S. for our global leadership team in September. And now we're carrying that conversation to the DI community. Then it's going to be taking it down to the employees in the different regions that we have, because we have our different regions: Central Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, Americas. And so the conversation will continue. And then we want these groups, and our ERGs are also being really impactful in carrying on this conversation. The listening, the education. We have to listen, and we have to understand. And then we need to make some movements, because we want to become not just listening and not being racist, maybe anti-racist. So we really need to move to KPIs action. And actions like we've already done in the U.S.
What does the communication look like around that?
What's interesting, I'll just give you an example. I think that, again, I want to highlight what the Americas team did. Most companies have a take your children to work day, right? Every year. But of course it's virtual and we're not taking anyone to work. So what they did in the Americas team is they organized these sessions for the children of our employees. And they had 2 sessions, one for 9 to 12 years old and one for 12 years old and older, with Dr. Gay talking about what is racism and bias. And because he's someone that is a consultant for Sesame Street. So he's very good at talking about these type of issues with children. And so it was like a substitution from take your children to work day, was a discussion on racism and bias with children and the parents of our employees. And so then the kids, had a really interesting discussion that was appropriate for their age. Then they left the virtual meeting, and then Dr. Gay talked to the parents who had questions about how do I continue this conversation with my children. So I think that's when you start talking to families and helping our employees be able to talk to their children, I think that the conversation becomes bigger.
How many people attended that?
I think, it was in Americas, we have, 400 employees, but it was smaller groups. So I think it was, like 40, and because you want to be able to have time to talk and just share, and for the kids to feel comfortable. So I think we can be very inclusive in the way we carry this conversation. It should be from senior leaders. It should be via the ERGs for their colleagues. It can be children of employees.
Mm-hmm. It's transcending it being a work thing, right? Which is really,
right. It's not a work thing. It's a culture thing.
Exactly.
Because we all know that there's racism everywhere in the world. It just has a different historical context, different history at how it. So whether you're talking about Italy or you're talking about France, there is racism, and sometimes people outside America would look at it as it's Black Lives Matter movement, and it doesn't really pertain to me in France. It pertains in a different way, though, and so that these conversations need to be local. They need to be they need to be awareness events, and then they need to take down to the local situation. But in terms of the general communication, I think it has to be in different levels. I mean, our CEO sent out some communication letters message from the CEO mm-hmm. about listening and learning, about becoming anti-racist. So he sent out that message to all employees around the world. But then, my D&I team has also been organizing these events to kind of carry on the conversation. So I think you have to have some strong statements from the top, but then you also need to have it be a bit grassroots, and then the ERGs develop their activities and more people participate. So kind of it goes in waves.
Being very impactful though. doing so. Is that something you guys came up with yourselves, or is that something you heard of other organizations doing in terms of involving the kids?
No, I'm not sure, because I have to give all the credit to the Americas team. I think they came up with themselves.
Never heard of anyone doing that, and I think it's really impactful. But I can imagine that most of those parents probably have never had that conversation with their kid at all, let alone
right.
having it in that context.
Our employees, our colleagues, are very happy to have someone who is an expert on how to talk to kids about these type of because they've seen the videos, they've seen maybe not the murder of George Floyd, but they've seen what's going on. They have a lot of questions that are very very serious, and how do I answer correctly? And so I think our employees really appreciated. Also, after the session with the children left, and then they could ask the questions of, how do I carry on this conversation? Or my son or daughter asked this question yesterday, how would I answer it? I think people are worried about saying the wrong thing. We're all worried about saying the wrong thing. And that's why sometimes we don't have the conversations, whether it's in the office or it's at home, whether it's a conversation about anything to do with inclusion or, racism.
We talked earlier about kind of the role of HR, D&I. How are you ensuring that the D&I work that you do extend beyond HR? I know one, great that you report directly into the CEO. That already is huge. That commitment says it already, right? And the fact that you've got this dedicated role. But is anything in particular that you're doing that others that are listening can do that's helped you transcend from it being a HR, being as opposed to everyone?
Yeah, and as we talked about before, I think it's impactful and powerful if it is everyone. So, but how do you engage everyone? So HR, of course, is our close partner, because you can't make this culture change without HR, as a really collaborator in this whole path. And there's some activities that HR leads, and there's some things that D&I lead, and we do it together. But then how to engage the rest of the organization? First of all, as you already said, you got to have leadership commitment, and not just the CEO. You need to have other senior leaders that are engaged. And a lot of ways we've engaged them is by having them be executive sponsors of our ERGs. So I think ERGs for us have been the next step forward to engage more employees at all different places in the world, in the Barilla world, or different levels or different jobs, because everyone that's in an ERG or is on the D&I board has another job. So when they go back, home to Singapore, to Sweden, and they have conversations with their local HR and with their ERGs, then the conversation starts, continuing in a broader context of the business, because they're bringing it, whether it's someone in supply chain is talking to their suppliers about D&I. We started a supplier diversity program, and it's like carrying on this idea of more inclusion and more diversity of our suppliers. So you're bringing it outside even the walls of Barilla. So I think the more people you can engage in set roles, either as a member of an ERG or leaders of ERGs, or an executive sponsor of an ERG, then you really start getting a lot of energy. It's like an army of people to make change, instead of just, as you said, Chris, one group that's the HR group or the D&I team.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of how the work you've done and the conversations and ideas that are in those ERGs have led to changes in the product and the way that you do? Because I kind of love those stories of sort of practical things that people maybe overlooked, that then kind of end up innovating the product, or not even a process in the organization and the way you think and the way things are done. Because a lot of times it's like, oh, why do we do it that way? Oh, because we always have. As well. Any examples of that?
So I would say two examples. One, and you were talking about products, and Barilla's a pasta and bakery and sauces company. One project that was sponsored by one of our ERGs here in Italy, it's ERG called THIS Ability, so THIS Ability, is to have it more inclusion of people with different abilities in the company. We developed and sponsored a program called Hackability, which is a program where we had consumers with disabilities come into our R&D center in the headquarters with our employees and with designers. And they co-created packages for our products. And so it's really insightful when you are interacting with someone with a different ability, and you understand what's the challenge to opening one of our products.
Wow.
So being able to read what's inside that box of pasta. And I'll tell you one story. When I heard it, because the consumer told us that the one thing he wanted on the pasta box, because most of the shapes of pasta are in the same size box. And if you live in,
you have no idea which shapes
exactly
the box.
So what he said he does is he buys 10 boxes of the same shape. And if you're in Italy, it's very important that your shape goes with your type of sauce. So you don't just randomly pull a shape and
we don't get that until you meet an Italian.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you find out.
Then you find out that sauce does not go with that pasta. So he would buy 10 of the same shape. So he'd buy 10 of penne, and then he use all of those, and then he would buy 10 of another one because
just so he would know.
Yeah, exactly. And he said the only thing I really need on that box in Braille or in a QR code is the shape and the cooking time, because it doesn't need all the ingredients. Because if you're, here in Italy, that pasta is made from semolina and water.
Doesn't need that stuff, yeah. So just having the Braille on the back on the box, and then
I can match my pasta and my sauce.
So simple as well, right? As an innovation for you and a team to execute on.
Exactly. So that's what we're now looking at, and now we're going beyond Braille to QR codes, and as we redesign packages. And then another thing, it's not a product, but it's a kind of a process. And I think many companies have started trying to figure out how to get the best learnings and interaction and collaboration between people of different generations. And here in Parma, we have a ERG called Young Generation. So it's for all the different generations. And they've actually piloted a reverse mentoring program, and which is really, I think, really good.
They highlighted that.
They piloted it and they organize it. With HR, and now we're going to, expand it to other countries that are interested. So I think your ERGs can be these pilots, these generating ideas, and you can't do all of them. You have to select, and HR has to be involved in which ones you can take forward. But all of us have small organizations. We don't have lots of HR people, lots of people in the D&I team. So when you use the ERGs because they want to be involved, you can really get a lot of things done. But you need to have, what I would say is, you need to have governance and a process for ERGs, to form, because it's not a mandate from senior management. ERGs are volunteers in the organization who want to form an ERG to promote inclusion of a specific affinity, or to make the invisible needs of the minority visible to the majority. So they can volunteer to do that as they like, and we put together a toolkit that talks about how to form an ERG. What's the governance? You need a charter, you need sponsors. So they know how the framework is, and that we allow people to have some local flexibility. So we have an ERG in Russia, we have an ERG in Brazil. So we have ERGs around the world, and they can choose what areas to focus on. So as long as you give governance and you give some, a support, money, sponsorship, I think that's a way to make a lot of culture.
Mm-hmm. But for you now, where do you kind of see moving forward? How long have you been in the role now?
This is my fourth year.
Fourth year. So you're actually coming up to the point where you're going to hand off to another?
It could be.
You mentioned, because you're only saying, because you mentioned that earlier as well. So it's 4 years now.
It's a rotating role. I know. Yeah. No, that's the thing. I think all of us in D&I, we say we don't leave D&I, we graduate. We graduate onto something else, and then someone else comes in, and but we still are the community of D&I. So
what are some of the things then? Because when that day does come, because it sounds like that may come sooner, what's the legacy that you want to leave? What's the biggest room for improvement before you leave? Is there anything else that kind of on you that you're really super passionate about, making sure that something you can leave behind that's impactful for everyone?
Oh, it's a good question. We talked a bit about the ERGs, and I think one of the areas that I will feel a lot of, I feel proud, an accomplishment that we've been able to expand the ERG's role and to engage more people. And I think that's a continuous journey. I'm not saying we need to double the number of ERGs, but the bigger challenge is to keep all those ERGs engaged, because they have a lot of energy and motivation. And what we're now focusing them more on is supporting our employees during this time of COVID crisis. Many of us are back in almost quasi lockdown, and they were hugely impactful during the first lockdown, to connect employees and to be able to listen to what the issues and challenges and everyone's facing from this difficult time. So the ERGs were really, I think all of our region presidents said that the ERGs were really the biggest help and support. So how do we provide that same kind of help, support, and piloting in the new blended way of working? So the ERGs can play a role in helping the culture change and adapt to the way we're going to work in the future, because it's going to be blended. I mean, we're going to need to rethink the role of the office. The office should be pulling people in, because in the office, in the future, we should be able to do things better than we can do by ourselves behind the screen alone.
Collaboration spaces, right? As opposed
exactly
to where work is done.
And how do you make sure that those are inclusive? How do you make sure that people understand the behaviors to be inclusive? You can use your ERGs to do that. And that's where I see the future wave of engagement with employees.
Amazing. Looking back, because on those 4 years, I'm sure they flew by.
Yes.
What would you wish you have known when you started that you know now?
So I think I was asked by another chief diversity officer, a colleague, a few weeks ago, what would I have done differently? I think that's what you're saying. I think
basically, yeah.
The advice I would say, and the thing that we did not do, two things. I think I really, when I reflect on this 7 years of D&I, one is we should have focused more on engaging everyone, especially people in our factories and our sales force who are out there in the field earlier on. I think I assumed that the messages and the interaction and the engagement and the inclusion of everyone was happening. And sometimes, when you assume, that's not a good thing to do. So I think we tried to pick it up by going and making sure that our D&I survey, which I think I mentioned earlier, which we do every 2 years, was really focusing on getting feedback from our sales force and our factory workers. And after we got feedback, actually, I got in the car with one of my D&I board members. We drove to all the factories in Italy and presented the results to engage the plants, to really be present. I think you can't assume it's done by someone else. You have to be there. And I think that's one thing I learned. The second we learned is that ERGs took a while in certain geographies to educate employees on what is an ERG and why to form one and why to participate. Certain cultures, it comes maybe more naturally because of elements of the culture, forming to make a change. But some cultures, it was really like, I don't really understand the purpose of this. So we need to take a step back. We thought we could just launch them or launch the concept and they would form.
Got to be unique to everyone again.
Exactly. And it has to be like local. You need to have some people who are very passionate locally to explain to others why this would be a good idea, even to explain to the senior leaders why ERGs are beneficial and to get some of them to be executive sponsors.
Imagine some of them had never even heard of the concept before.
No, they had not heard of the concept. And we kind of assumed that we could take an ERG from America and kind of bring it over and have an event and people in Italy and people would sign up. We had like 20 people sign up. It was like hundreds of people at the event and 20 people signed up because they didn't really understand the concept of ERG. So we stepped back and did much more education on what is it, why is it beneficial? The phrase I told you is make the invisible needs of the minority visible to the majority, started to resonate. And it was really focusing a lot on allies. When you focus on allies, then you start making a culture change and it spreads.
Mm-hmm. It builds momentum, right? Together.
Yes, exactly.
And it just emphasizes it now because you mentioned the remote workforce. This is kind of everyone's the remote workforce at this stage as well. Before it was just the factory workers and the sales execs and some others that are out in the field. Now everyone's out in the field. So we have to be conscious of how we're doing that and how we're reaching everyone, right? Exactly. Whether it's making sure we have a mobile first approach. So even if you're a factory worker or on the road, you have, you can connect with everyone via the app or whatever that may be. I know some organizations recently have had in their manufacturing sites, they're launching their own radio stations. So that all the factory workers listen to the radio and they filter messages into the factories that way. It's a really fun, cool way of doing it. So it's actually forced many organizations to innovate and to be able to do that. It's no longer an afterthought. It's
right. And I think getting employee feedback, sending the messages out, via whatever means, and then getting employee feedback is really key. I mean, we're going to run our 5th D&I survey in the middle of May of next year. And then we're going to add some questions that are specific about COVID and to really see during the crisis, during lockdown, how did inclusion increase in some ways or decrease, which can help you frame the new blended way of working.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be powerful because we can compare it to previous years. So, our survey results are part of our KPIs. Our KPIs are based on, demographics of women in leadership and women in the talent pool, but it's also based on leadership commitment and flexibility and inclusion from our survey. So again, KPI, you're not going to achieve what you don't measure.
Yeah. How's it going to be for you? Are you going to, I know, I appreciate you don't have to tell me on the podcast if you don't want to feel comfortable, but after this role, are you going to be going back to the previous role? What was your previous role beforehand?
I was running part of the research group within Barilla. But no, I think I kind of like new challenges. So for me, I've, basically said I would be open for something else in the organization.
I think that's a trend we've seen throughout this episode. If everyone's listening, you're not shy of a challenge, and that's something which I see in many of your colleagues and peers that are successful. Like where they thrive is in almost in uncertainty and trying something new, and that's what's exciting, right? Because I think one of the reasons I quit my last job after being there, if I was doing the same job for 10 years, and I was like, I enjoy it, I'm good at it, but am I progressing? Am I pushing myself beyond my limits and challenging myself? And that's kind of the sweet spot where I want to be. I went to the extreme part of it and started a company, which
you went all the way to the other side. But to challenging yourself, one thing I would put out there to the audience as a big challenge is one of the things we've worked on for the last 4 years since 2016, which is gender pay gap and gender pay equality. And I really say start that process. I think people sometimes say, well, it's going to take a while, and how long is it going to take, and how much is it going to cost for us to become gender pay equal? But again, if you don't know where you are, if you don't know what your gap is, how will you ever get to a commitment to remove it? So we became gender pay equal this year. So we're proud of that achievement. And it took years. We knew that what our gap was. We had analyzed every year. We in our salary process reduced the gap, and then last year.
How long did that take, by the way? Because obviously you need buy-in from the leadership team, the investors, everyone really. So how long did that take?
It took from 2016 until this year.
Wow.
So again, it was because we had great leadership commitment from our chairman, from our CEO, and we had a D&I board, external advisors who were saying you really need to start working on this. HR led the program, and they did a great job. They developed the algorithm with the university that could assess from the data what are the unjustified pay gaps, because we will have pay gaps if someone's longer in a position than another person. But which ones are the unjustified? And then you get to the ones that they're the unjustified, and then you have to have a plan in place to reduce them and eliminate them. And then at the end, when you become gender pay equal, which we got verified by KPMG, you need to put a process in place in your HR processes to make sure that you don't get new gaps. So this is to
unravel back in the same direction again.
Yeah, because you were talking about processes. You have to evolve your processes to make sure that this is that they're inclusive, and that you put these new kind of controls in place so that you don't get a gap in the future.
Yeah. What was the biggest challenge briefly then? I don't go too much into it, but what was the biggest challenge in those 4 years?
Well, there was a challenge to make sure that we had done, the data correctly in HR. As I said, it developed an algorithm. I think the challenge was at the end, we wanted to make sure we had external eyes looking at our process. So it wasn't just us looking at our process. So we did ask KPMG to go look at our process, so they verified that our process was robust. And so I think that was the end step challenge, is how do we get to this external eyes? Because, there's no global one organization for gender pay equality certification. There's many different ways you can go. And so we determined our way, and that's where we ended up. So we're proud of that as a this year accomplishment.
Amazing. Well, look, before we wrap up, there's a lot of information to take in there. So thanks so much
no, it's
for taking the time out to join me. It means a lot to me. And
us talking about D&I, we think sometimes we could talk for hours sharing what we've learned. Yeah.
You've already shared so much, but before we wrap up, if there's sort of one thing, one parting piece of advice you could give to everyone or other, peers that are new on their journey, what would that be? And where's the best place people can connect with you if they want to reach out and say hello and connect with you?
The pieces of advice, I think is some that I already said, but I'll just summarize it down to two things. If you're starting in this journey, connect with others. You'll find so many people who are willing to share what's working, with different teams. We're a member of the D&I Conference Board in the EU, and we have a WhatsApp group, so people are always asking questions. You're going to do inclusive leadership. What provider did you like? Have you been, looking at data for demographics for race in Europe? So there's a lot of learning. So connect with others and organizations. And then at a certain point in your journey, probably not the first step if you're starting, but at a certain point, try to engage employees via networks or ERGs, because that will really make the next step. You start with leadership commitments, that will move the D&I agenda beyond your committee or your board. It'll be a broader audience. And then you say where to connect. People can find me on LinkedIn. And also if they want, I'm very happy to share things like our D&I survey, our toolkit for ERGs. It's, whatever people can be helpful for others. And it's also great to connect because we learn something from what other companies are doing, and that can help us in our future challenges as well, because we have we all have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we're all in this together. And that's my same reason that we're here on the show together right now. I reached out to you originally, and now we've connected on a number of occasions, and here we are. We don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. There's so many people out there that have been there, done it as well. And just be willing to take a moment to reach out, especially around D&I more than most things. People really, passionate to help and share. So great advice.
No, I think this is the time. I mean, this is, how could there be a better time to work on this very important topic and to be more inclusive? We as companies will then influence the culture externally, and we shouldn't worry about it being perfect. It'll never be perfect. It's progression, not perfection.
And there's no end goal on this. It's
no end goal. And I just love, I don't know if you saw this, Chris, but there was just a WhatsApp going around that the quote, because every year there's a specific quote. The quote for 2020, "You're on mute." That's the quote for 2020.
That is actually the quote for 2020 as well. Well, look, thanks again for tuning everyone and listening, and thank you so much, Kristen, for sharing your experience and insights. I'm excited to see where you go next with the career as well. Maybe move into another region of the world.
Always open to that. Yeah.
Always open. But if you're new, if you're listening and you're new, make sure you hit the subscribe button, follow us on your favorite platform. Also, make sure you connect with Kristen on LinkedIn. Head over there and say hello. Apart from that, enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you soon, Kristen.
Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye.